What comes to your mind when you hear the label Christian fiction? Well, if you grew up evangelical or heard some stereotypes, you likely think of some negative assumptions. For example, you might assume that Christian fiction almost always has predictable plots, shallow characters, and cheap evangelism. Even when some of these stories might have these things, how can we avoid our own cliched notions about all of those bad Christian-made novels?
Speculative fiction, like no other genre, reflects the creativity of God.
If you look at the scriptures, you're going to have to see that God uses imagination more than rational discourse.
We are supposed to be image bearers for a vastly creative God.
Reading fantastical fiction opened a portal in my imagination for a place other than just a materialistic world.
I experienced the gospel story with the mind of someone who loved adventure and loved the idea of light conquering darkness.
We're wired for stories that reflect how we see the world in ways that are true.
The story is either pointing to Christ or it's pointing to our need for Christ.
Welcome aboard the Highbridge of Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, in which we explore fantastical stories for God's glory. I'm Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven, and I am a Christian, and I made a novel.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and you are listening to Burnett and Russell, the new criticism of all things Christian. No, we're not going to do that show. Someone else has already done that show. This is episode 209 of Fantastical Truth. How can we avoid cliched criticism of Christian fiction?
Zach, do you think that we would have made it big if we just sat around and blasted the bad Christian fiction of yesteryear? Or do you think maybe it's worth it to take the road less traveled, the slower pace, a little bit of a harder path to find the stories that we like and praise them, and then in some cases actually make our own? Some of you listeners may have picked up some hints here and there, but it is true. I am now a contracted novelist myself, so this topic actually arrives just in time to complement what I've been up to behind the scenes all this time.
That is so great, Stephen. I'm truly celebrating with you. And it's just so awesome that you have chosen that route to be a creator and not a critic. That's a big topic that we're going to talk about today, about being, we all have our opinions about art and stories and music and movies and books, but it's just so much more fun to be a creator. And that is so cool that you are entering now into that official world of being a published creator.
It shouldn't change a whole lot about Lorehaven, but as of this morning, I'm finally able to talk about it. The contract is with Enclave Publishing, actually, our top sponsor for this episode. So in a moment, we'll get to that sponsorship. Can't say a title. They don't have a cover or anything like that. Those are to be announced. But as a lot of people know, most of my life, I have been exploring biblical truth and fantastic imagination. But yeah, here comes the plot twist. All along, I've also been saving ideas for my own story. Like a certain grand ship, this story's been waiting in the hangar. It's needed some system repairs. And right now, I'm actually out there on the hull, scrubbing, getting some extra polish on there. We're just waiting for just the right moment for launch, which should be next year, maybe more like the first quarter of the year is what I've been told. I am blessed now to work with the fantastic Enclave crew up there on the bridge on this mission that may fulfill the dream of one special family who was exiled to a dead world, and they may even save the church of the future. That's a little hint there, and watch this space for further details. I've got my newly reborn website, estephenburnett.com, set up. Hopefully, Lord willing, as of this day, you can sign up there and get some updates, and that'll be the home for that. And some of those details may leak over to this podcast and at Lorehaven, but Lorehaven celebrates all manner of genres, fantastical stories for God's glory, not just sci-fi, obviously, but fantasy, paranormal, spiritual warfare, all of that stuff. So I'll try to rope my stuff off to estephenburnett.com. That's your command center for updates. Meanwhile, at Lorehaven, you can subscribe free for weekly reviews every Friday, including our most recent review for James R. Hannibal's Lion Warrior. That is the conclusion to the Light Raider Academy fantasy series. Just edited the review for another Enclave title, actually. It's by another author who did that review there. That is a Hybrid by Candace Cade. That'll be out this coming Friday after this episode. By the way, we did release the episode a few hours later, just to not get ahead of that announcement, which should go out this morning. So any of y'all who tend to listen earlier, that's the reason for the delay. Subscribing free at Lorehaven also gets you the site updates whenever we publish articles, like Jeneth Dick's coverage of the Prince Caspian on stage performance. She had that article out last week after a terrific episode last week, to go catch up on those. But signing up free lets you into the Lorehaven Guild, where we undertake monthly book quests into the best Christian made fantastical novels we can find, stories that we like, stories that we can get behind, stories that don't need a lot of criticism, but that represent the future of Christian fantastical fiction, including titles like this one from our top sponsor, Enclave Publishing, Lion Warrior. We just reviewed that one from James R. Hannibal. That's releasing today, April the 23rd. The Dragon War has breached the barrier. The forces of the liberated land are near to breaking. Without a heavy and rapid shift in the assembly strategy, a dragon invasion will be unstoppable. Connor and Kara have kept the full knowledge of the Red Dagger's location secret for almost a year. A chance to destroy Helior and end the war is within the Light Raider Order's grasp. They must now reveal what they know and call for action. Every path that lies before the cadets seems a great risk. The slightest misstep may cost them their lives, their loved ones, and their homeland. But to do nothing means certain failure. To succeed, they must charge ahead into dark uncertainty and trust the rescuer. Enclave Escape presents Lion Warrior, the third book in the Light Raider Academy series by James R. Hannibal. It's available today wherever fantastic books are sold. Order now online or ask for it at your favorite bookseller or your local library. It's also available in audio from Oasis Audio. All links, cool cover in the show notes for episode 209, this episode, or go to lorehaven.com/podcast. Zach, writing books, fighting dragons, sharing great stories, not just blasting the bad ones, makes me hungry. So let us break out some healthy snacks without a lot of saturated fats at our locally famous concession stand. I will say that if you're here for the Zach and Steven Criticize Everything show, well, we occasionally slip and we do stuff like that. Like our episode, I forget which name it is, but links in the show notes. We already had an episode about the cringe evangelical stuff. Kevin McCreary joined us. He's a YouTuber who has previously roasted a lot of Christian-made movies, but oddly enough, he's actually off making new stuff himself. So great career path to follow there. Criticizing the cringe stuff is, I think, a necessary thing to do, but we only do that here as a side project. We mentioned bad stories on occasion too. I think recently I slipped and I mentioned a very bad evangelical novel from the early 1990s, an end times novel that was not a Left Behind book. I even said the name. So we occasionally name names, especially if the book is like The Shack and we think, you know what, this has some cringe ball stuff in there and maybe even some harmful ideas. So we're not above calling out names, but Zach was talking before the show and we were talking about the show. Like, we don't want to be known for that stuff. Like, that sort of thing turns you into a grifter. Now you've got to be a negative Nelly all the time in order to get those sweet, sweet clicks and views. And is that worth it for the cost to your soul? I'm going to leave that question hanging there. Conversely, though, especially if you grew up evangelical, you may have only heard people praise Christian fiction from the skies. Well, that person wrote the book and that person is a Christian, so it must be good. And then if you open the book and you find out it's terrible, suddenly you start to think, wait a minute, Christians will just let you get away with anything so long as you want to save souls. Well, we're aware of that risk. But in this episode, we're not talking about that. Instead, we're going to talk about cringe criticisms of Christian fiction. And this was Zach's idea, by the way, based on an older article I'd thrown into the idea pile a while ago. The older article was a little more negative. It was called How to Be a Silly Christian Fiction Critic. And Zach, I think, rightly suggested, you know what? Given our more positive emphasis, let us give that a more positive spin. So that's what we're doing today. Instead of my original 7 ways to be a silly Christian fiction critic, I've turned that into 6 constructive ways to be a good Christian fiction critic. Zach, any other piping hot, healthy concessions to share?
Yeah. So my foundational principle for this whole topic is Matthew 12:20, where it says that Jesus would not break a bruised reed and a smoldering wick he would not put out. And this was a verse that God spoke to me way back in 2010 when I was starting to enter into the Christian filmmaking world. There were a lot of Christian movies coming out around that time, a lot of really bold steps being taken by small Christian studios or Christian filmmakers working with, medium or large size Hollywood studios. And so we were getting more and more and more Christian movie content. And like any industry, when you're kind of on that ragged edge, there's a lot of things that just aren't, really up to the standards of other creators and other types of work that we're familiar with. You could turn on a Christian movie and find bad writing, bad acting, bad camera work, bad lighting, bad costume design, any number of filmmaking things. You could find pretty bad examples in there. But this was, like I said, a very burgeoning industry. I mean, Christian films have been around a long time, but it seemed like around 2010. I mean, again, it's kind of my selection bias because that's when I was really entering into this in my ministry job that I work at. But I really did see a serious push by Christian studios to create more. It's just too easy to criticize something when it's young or when it's taking big steps. But I just think about Jesus, like would Jesus be, wagging his finger at all these Christian creators and making fun of them? I mean, not to be all WWJD, but really, like that's not how he acted, and that's not how he treats us. And I didn't want to be that way towards others. That in a lot of cases, these are people that have scraped together their life savings or called in every favor they can to put out this film, or just taking a crazy step of faith, and they have no idea what they're doing, but they're trying to follow the Lord. So I don't want to be the one to, to break that bruised reed. So ever since then, that sort of animated my perspective towards all kinds of Christian art. It would just be so easy to pile on, but the world is doing that enough. Like you said, Stephen, I think the one exception is when Christian art is on balance, turning people away from Christ, turning people towards bad doctrine, really reinforcing some bad ideas that, look, we've all got imperfect theology. We've all got imperfect lifestyles. I'm talking about overall when something, the majority of it is leading people away.
I think this is more a question of what is wise and what is less wise or even foolish, rather than it's a question of absolute good and absolute bad. Unless the book contains heresy or false teaching, then a lot of these criticisms or praises can be fairly subjective. I'm thinking actually of Acts 18, 24, which describes in brief this account of a very gifted teacher named Apollos, a native of Alexandria. And the book of Acts is extremely positive about Apollos, even while noting that he had some growing to do. It says he was a learned man with a thorough knowledge of the scriptures. He had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and he spoke with great fervor and taught about Jesus accurately, though he knew only the baptism of John. So here's a guy who's been called and gifted and extremely talented, and yet has a deficiency. He needs people to come along and train him. And that is what happened. It's just being described here in the book of Acts. A power couple in the early church named Priscilla and Aquila got wind of Apollos' ministry. And it says they invited him to their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately. Now, this is about teaching and this is about nonfiction ministry in this kind of context, but I think there is some overlap here between this calling and the calling of a Christian creator. Just like we heard about in our last episode with Noah Stratton with the Logos Theater. He was talking about how performance in a theatrical setting is very much like proclaiming, which is like preaching. And so there's a lot of overlap there. Sometimes you start out extremely gifted and talented. You may need some extra training in order to get good and make the movie or book even better. I think ought to be the role of the Christian critic, is that to be a constructive critic, not like Anton Ego from Ratatouille, going out there and just sneering at what he thinks is a subpar meal at a French restaurant, but actually being open to a new experience, even if it turns out that the chef is a rat underneath the hat. Love that ending there of Brad Bird's Ratatouille. And ever since I have thought of Anton Ego's wonderful little essay at the end about criticism and the purpose of criticism and how it ought to be about joy, not cynicism. So that's what we're about here. Not saying don't criticize. We're saying that, hey, just like stories can use some improvement, our criticisms can also use some improvement. And that starts with getting beyond the little cliches and clickbait that can creep into criticism. So unless I want to get into further rhyming words there, let's go to chapter 1 here. Well, it's not chapter 1. It's actually kind of a 6-part structure here. We haven't done those in a while, Zach. But number 1 here, clear outdated nonsense and read today's books. Sometimes in some random comments I see here and in there, people just don't keep track about what's going on with Christian-made fiction. They assume it's all Amish romance. and or coloring books, or maybe they assume that the Left Behind series is still dominating, and the Left Behind series still sells very well. And I think it's unfair to say that's bad Christian fiction, but they assume it's all end times books, spiritual warfare, angels, things like that. Basically, they're remembering the greatest hits of evangelical trends of yesteryear that aren't around anymore, with the exception of romance. But that's really unfair to criticize Christian fiction for that, because romance is the top book genre anywhere, not just for Christians or evangelicals. And by the way, in passing, I would note that even those silly seeming trends are an improvement over today's top evangelical cultural trend, which is politics, politics, politics all the time, sticking to the floor. It gets everywhere. I'd prefer even the coloring books with angels and little boys going to heaven over politics getting everywhere. But a lot of those trends are now gone. They're not around anymore. So I think that some critics need to catch up to the present, like just like some Christian made fiction, which is what I mean by Christian fiction, can get stuck in traditions and tropes of the past. The criticisms can also be stuck in the past. So if you're going to make a career or even make a passing observation about what Christian fiction is like, I think you, the critic, need to do more than a casual glance into your distant memory files of the stuff you remember hearing about in your church in 1995. You need to be aware of what's going on today with today's novels and movies, beyond just the ones that rise to the very top of the bestseller lists and become the topic of casual conversations. We here at Lorehaven try to help make that happen by reviewing the best Christian-made fantastical novels wherever they're found. It can be a publisher like Enclave. It can be another small publisher, medium publisher, large publisher, or an indie publisher. People are making their own books and publishing them, and sometimes those are really, really good, and you cannot tell the difference. So look for the best ones, not just the bad ones or the really popular ones that you remember from previous eras. Seek the best ones, and that means looking for the folks who've already found them. I would put Lorehaven in that category because we do have new reviews every Friday of the best Christian-made fantastical novels we can find. So we're trying to already be selective about the best ones, and that's part of our review philosophy is we don't unduly criticize, because if a book is bad, if the cover is terrible, and believe me, I have seen some howlers, then we're just going to move on politely, because we want to be the place where you can find the good stuff for the best audiences. We try to match books to the readers who will enjoy them the most, note some discernment stuff in passing, and then let people decide what books they want to try out after we've already vetted them as best we can.
Yeah. So if you're a new listener to our podcast, we're talking about the library and review section on lorehaven.com, our main website. That's where we list all the books that we have read and reviewed or that we know about and that we want to talk about. There's plenty of things that we could have reviewed, and we thought we're just going to give this a bad review, and we just don't want to go there because, again, we don't want to break the bruised reed or put out the smoldering wick. You know, Stephen, I was just in a conversation the other day with some folks, just some new folks that I met through my job, and I was trying to, I didn't know what their reading habits were like. I didn't know what kind of books they like, so I was trying to very politely, carefully describe the types of books you typically see in a Christian bookstore or in a Christian fiction section of a bookstore. And this lady just jumped to the end. She's like, "You're talking about bonnet fiction." Oh yeah, I'm so sick of bonnet fiction. And I was like, yeah, that's the right label. You know, and I appreciated that she knew that is kind of the stereotype of Christian bookstores, but she seemed aware that's not all that's out there. And, you know, to you, our listener, again, if you're a new listener, that may be what you've come into the Christian bookstore expecting, is only to find bonnet fiction or historical fiction, whatever. And man, there's so much more out there, but you wouldn't know it. If your only exposure to Christian literature was that bookstore section, you would think that's all there was. And it's because so much of fiction now is independently published, and it's just simply not going to be in a bookstore. Bookstores primarily carry traditionally published authors, and that's just such a small corner of the market now in terms of volume. And so we want to help you find more books that are outside of what you're expecting.
Yeah, if you can find any Christian bookstores left, there's some indie ones out there, but just like an indie book had trouble showing up in a Christian bookstore, now it's a little hard to find an indie bookstore, so it's gone a little bit meta. But if you walk into a Barnes & Noble or some of these other American chains, or I don't know what other chains are in other countries, you're unlikely to find much more than the absolute best-selling, traditionally published Bonnet books, not likely to be listed under the Christian fiction label, but under inspirational. That's one of my all-time favorite words, Zach. I just love inspirational, which gums up the doctrine of inerrancy and everything. That's such a very interesting word. I knew there'd be a little snark in this episode, as positive as we try to be. So just imagine how much worse it would be if we decided, hey, let's go in to be snarky. Point number 2 here, I would say too, if you want to be a better critic of Christian fiction, is don't compare fiction title apples with oranges. Don't compare the apples with the oranges. And this is what I mean by that. A good critic knows the intent of a story and is able to compare the intent of a story with what it actually turned out to be. And the critic is able to manage his own expectations. For example, Zach, I saw recently there's a new Zack Snyder movie, Rebel Moon Part 2, out on Netflix. And enough said about what kinds of violence and nonsense is going to be in the extended edition that may make me have to quit talking about this fandom at all. But apparently the PG-13 movie is getting pilloried by critics. And I saw one review that said, this is a weird and humorless sci-fi. And I thought that is a bad review, or at least a bad headline, because why would you expect it to have a particular kind of humor? What are you going in expecting? Nobody got out of Dune Part 2 and said, oh, it was too weird and humorless. Why? Because Dune Part 2 was cool, and Zack Snyder is not cool. So we're going by the rule of cool, not by what's on screen or what the story is, but by whether or not the director is trendy. And I hate, is not too strong of a word, those kinds of expectations. I think they're foolish, and they're not looking for what a story is trying to be. They're just looking for the rule of director cool. I remember a much cooler movie critic, the late Roger Ebert, back in 2001, when a little movie called The Fellowship of the Ring came out. Roger Ebert didn't like it. He originally had a very bad and negative take on it. Now, imagine he was one of the first critics to get to it, and he hedged because he could tell, wow, this is something really extraordinary. But he was a fan of Tolkien's original books, and he acknowledged he expected a little bit more walking and singing and not so much orc beheading and action moment. Now, the films have walking and singing, it's true, especially in the extended editions. But yeah, of course, they're going to err on the side of the action adventure, which is in the book, but cranked up to 11 for the film version. Ebert, however, I think was smarter than this. And by the time The Two Towers came around, he actually showed his work in the review of The Two Towers, which I really appreciated. And he said, okay, my job is to review the movie I was given, not the movie I made up in my head. Here's what I said about Fellowship. I still believe it. But now let's review the actual movie that we're given. It's phenomenal. And so he was able to hedge his expectations and adjust them and appreciate the films for what they were. So let's learn from one of the most famous movie critics if we're going to go for book criticism and manage our expectations. And here's one application of that. Don't intentionally compare books that are meant to be accessible, meant to hit a certain reading level, for example, in order to get to the most amount of readers. Don't compare those with classical literature works. I see this sometimes, especially among certain educated academical types of Christians. Now, the best academical types of Christians, like Ted Turneau, my co-author on the Pop Culture Parent, like they can switch back and forth. Like Ted can do worldview studies, and he knows how to do MLA citations and all the rest of it. But he also loves anime cartoons and Marvel movies, and he was able to manage that stuff. Some academical sorts, though, they really don't want there to be accessible popular fiction at all, it seems. They would rather have Christians read Flannery O'Connor short stories, where the evil white Southern Baptist ends up killing everybody in the family vacation. I had to read that story too. I guess it worked for what it was trying to be. I don't go to that story expecting a comic book or a Sherwood Pictures movie. And I don't think the folks who like that sort of thing should go to a Sherwood Pictures movie expecting a Flannery O'Connor short story. That is silly at best. And at worst, it can actually turn into kind of a sinful arrogance. And some people say elitist, and I try to avoid using that word, but I think I would go so far as to say that this can become arrogant and ignore the fact that even among Christian brothers and sisters, we have the right and even the God-given gift to have preferences. Don't assume that there is a high art and a low art, and the high art is more spiritual and the low art is for people who still have cranial ridges from an earlier stage in evolution. By the way, that's a pagan assumption about people, and it's kind of a little racist too. So don't assume that there is a higher form of music, and that's European classical, and there's a lower form, which is that hip hop stuff with all the beat. Like, guy, you're kind of being a little racist there. And I want to be careful with using that word too. But it really is about just assuming that one type of story or art is better or more spiritual than another type of story or art. That's the assumption behind a lot of these bad comparisons between fiction apples and fiction oranges. Know what the story is trying to do, and then evaluate whether it did that well for the reader or viewer that it was trying to reach. And if we have problems with that, I think really what we're struggling with is dislike of certain kinds of people. That, I think, is a matter of Christ-like love and actual commandments rather than subjective criticism. Now we really do need to practice love for different kinds of people. And I think that can start by practicing an appreciation for the things that they're interested in, even if it's not a genre or story that we would like, so long as it's not going to tempt them to sin any more than usual. This is about wisdom, not about absolute right or wrong or what's spiritually better.
You know, that review you read, the Zack Snyder movie Rebel Moon, of it being weird and humorless, it actually makes me more interested in that film, because what that says to me is that it's, you know, unique and imaginary and serious. And that's the kind of sci-fi that I like. I don't like fanciful and comical, self-referential, facetious sci-fi, kind of like, I'm sorry, but The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, I tried to get into that and I just couldn't. And I have several friends that love that book, and I don't know how they feel about the movie, but they they reference it all the time, and that's just not my cup of tea. But I'm not going to say that that's the wrong kind of sci-fi either. It's different tastes and it's different genres or subgenres, and I think that's totally fine. You're right, Stephen, to have different desires for things. You know, you just look at the Bible. Look how many different genres there are in the Bible. As you said, it's not just one book. We all know that it's 66 books, but there's so many different genres. And then even within the stories that the Bible tells, both the nonfiction stories and the fictional stories that people tell in the Bible, there are so many different kinds of stories there. There's so many different kinds of visions and dreams that people have. Like, I mean, it has everything in there, right? And it can be a challenge sometimes, like our family is going through a Bible reading plan, and it can be a challenge to go from one book to the next. We have kind of a blended approach to reading the Old and New Testament. And sometimes that can be jarring because there's so many different approaches that God uses to get to his truth. So yeah, I think with Christian fiction, we have to see, where did they put this in the market and what are the expectations of those genres? And, you know, we have covered this on the podcast. We have a series called Fiction's Chief End, where we've talked about the purposes and the conventions, but also how we need these different genres of fantasy, sci-fi, and even horror. And we'll probably do some more genres like that in the future if that's what y'all would like to hear.
Speaking of science fiction with different expectations, our second sponsor is Liam Corley, the author of a debut science fiction novel called Changelings Insurgents. Some sci-fi stories I might mention are a little more grounded, a little different from Rebel Moon or some of the more weird, humorless stories. And then you get a sci-fi story like this. Commander Talrun didn't travel from the 26th century to kidnap a forgotten healer, but he will if that's what it takes to save his mutant son. To end the war between humans and their mutant offspring, Talrun recruits a criminal, a scientist, and a scholar to search for genes that will purge the mutation. But trusting each other turns out to be the real fight. Changelings Insurgents is a debut science fiction novel by Liam Corley, published by Millspeak Books. It's available wherever fine books are sold. We've got purchase links in our show notes for episode 209, or you can go to lorehaven.com/podcast and look for Liam Corley there. Changelings Insurgents. Yeah, I think, Zach, a lot of people look back on stories that they may think or they may hear the critics say now are bad. And note that I put the word bad there in the heaviest of air quotes. Okay, I'm going to pause and make the air quotes symbol right now. There it is. Point number 3, let's recall how God used bad stories to help you. And I don't even need to go to scripture for this necessarily. It's just a matter of wisdom to understand that if you look at fans now who look back on old cartoons that they used to like really crudely animated anime, it was a bad dub, they recycled animation, or maybe they look back on B movies from the 1980s. Zach, you may look back on a few of those, I imagine. You look back on those and you go, okay, you know what? Okay, that was technically a bad movie, but it had a lot of heart and it landed right when I needed it. So they look back on this with fondness. Most people, for example, now, I'm not talking about an 80s movie, but one of the supposedly bad superhero movies, Green Lantern from 2011, a lot of people don't like it. But for some reason, that one really landed with me. Guess you could call it a superhero landing. Ryan Reynolds himself makes fun of the movie, but even recently he went back and he watched it. It was just a few years ago, and he kind of live tweeted through it. And he was making fun, but at the end, I guess he made his peace with it. And he thought, you know what? That wasn't nearly so bad. I think you hadn't even seen it before because the production was so troubled or something. So I recognize it's flawed and not in keeping with the greater Green Lantern mythos, but somehow that movie worked for me. And I've seen it 2 or 3 times since then, and it still works. That the overall theme about fighting fear with courage. A lot of people also appreciate these positive attributes of stories that critics, snarky ones or legit ones, say, well, that's a bad story. And they'll particularly lambast supposedly bad Christian-made fiction without understanding that the fiction was made with a particular goal and a particular audience in mind that may not have included them. So, like, critic dude, it's okay to just say, you know what, this wasn't for me. But people, for example, like Zach and I connected over an article I wrote called Actually the Left Behind series is pretty awesome. And that's another benefit, by the way, of not being such a snarky critic is you meet more friends this way. You connect over stuff that you like, even if you recognize some of the differences that you may have with the project now. For instance, about the Left Behind series, like I would not call that a bad series at all. And not just because we're going to be talking about it a lot this summer, but the Left Behind authors, Tim LaHaye, the late Tim LaHaye, and now, by the way, his wife now is also late. So they are in glory together, Beverly LaHaye, as of last week. Jerry Jenkins is still around, and he will still talk about how, you know what, we set out with a specific goal for this series. Tim LaHaye wanted to do this, this, and this. And I, as the fiction writer, had to ensure that the style, was accessible for a thriller that incorporated these particular understandings of prophecy. He wanted the books to be accessible, and Jerry Jenkins calls himself a journeyman author. His job is to write to genre. He will write in all kinds of genres: fiction, nonfiction, biography, sports biography, thriller, contemporary, romance, drama. He's all over the place. And every single one of those genres has rules, and he knows them. And the rule for Left Behind series was reach as many people as possible while still being a grown-up fiction book for grown-up readers. And I'd say now that God has used that series, the Left Behind series, despite whatever flaws you may pick up on it now, to get many, many fans, not just interested in the end times, but interested in Christian thrillers, futuristic drama and thrillers. And I would, by the way, put myself in that category too. I doubt that Lorehaven would exist. I wouldn't have tried writing my own books. I wouldn't now have one under contract coming out next year if it wasn't for the Left Behind series. Now, did I copy the Left Behind series? No. I have a very different take on the future that doesn't involve anybody's vision of prophecy, but I still have Left Behind to thank for my creative growth. It turns out that the Holy Spirit, I'd say, can use, air quotes, bad art to help his people grow. Despite any of the shortcomings of the art, so long as the creator was not sinning or tempting people to sin any more than usual, then you can't condemn that story as if it was full of heresy or something. So I say let's keep that truth in mind. Even when you see the flaws in stories, appreciate for how God is using them for other people and maybe even for yourself.
Stephen, this is not the eschatology episode, but I will briefly
not yet. I'm planning one.
But I will briefly say I probably have the most depressing eschatological understanding, which is, or at least theory, which is premillennial post-tribulation rapture.
Yeah, that's Marvin the Paranoid Android eschatology there, to reference Hitchhiker's Guide.
Yeah, so basically premillennial, the world is going to get worse. The Antichrist is going to take over with the one world government. I believe in all of that. I just don't believe there will be a rapture of the church before all that happens. I think we are all going to go through it. And when Jesus returns and gathers us up into the air, it's when he's coming down, Revelation 19, to with everyone else who's fallen asleep in Christ. So that's the rapture. I don't think it's we get exempted from the tribulation. I think if we're still alive, we're going to go through it.
No, we're going to get letters about this.
Yep. And so, but the reason I say that is because I just legitimately call it the most depressing view. And I have yet to find a book that actually represents this view. But what do? I go out and collect eschatology fiction from all the other views. So we've mentioned Left Behind, that's premillennial, pre-tribulation. Another of my favorite ones is the Christ Clone trilogy, which is very similar to eschatology, just sort of different spin on it, different focus and perspective. And then there's at the other end of the spectrum, there's the Lamb Among the Stars, which is the postmillennial perspective, which is that humans will build a galactic Christian empire and then Christ will return. And that's awesome. Like, that's so cool. All of these views are so much cooler and have so much cooler fiction. But I love collecting these books, even if I don't really hold to either side of that, because God has done something powerful and memorable in my life through these stories when I read them at different times over the last 20 years. And I read all those books electronically, and I have found little by little really nice hardback editions of all of those books, and they're all sitting on the shelf behind me because what I've sort of looked at them as is Ebenezer's. This was the practice in the Old Testament when God would do something incredible, powerful, miraculous, important in the lives of the Israelites. They would basically make these little stacks of stones that were to memorialize that God did something here in time and space in my life. And that's why I've collected these physical books and not just relied on the ebooks. I want to look at them all the time and remember what God has done in my life. And I still enjoy these books. I may or may not read them. I want my kids to read them because I want them to understand how these stories have shaped me. But with apologies to my wife, Naomi, she doesn't really collect things, especially books. She thinks, yeah, you finish a book, you move on, give it away, sell it, return it to the library. I'm a pack rat. I admit that. I'm a recovering pack rat. But I'm also very sentimental. And I keep these books as a memory and out of thanks for God.
Hey, I still have promotional posters from the Lifeway, or was it Family Christian Bookstore, for Left Behind books. Was it 8? No, it was 8. I think it's actually only the even numbered ones, 8, 10, and 12. And 12 is when Jesus came back, released about 20 years ago, by the way. Well, let's go to point number 4, kind of related to this one. So while recalling how God used bad stories to help you, supposedly bad, the next step is to self-critique by challenging your expectations. If you want to be a critic, then you need to be a good critic of yourself. And I think one thing that people say or hint at that comes in for criticism from the Christian culture bad random critiques is they don't offer any alternative. They just want to sit there and throw pot shots at the people who are making stuff, and they really don't have an idea about what they want instead. Meanwhile, the folks who are saying secular culture bad, the Christians who are saying that, they're making new stuff, and they're especially making new stuff now, whether it's books or TV shows or movies. And so they're following the advice that the snarky Christian critics used to say, well, don't just curse the darkness, but light a candle. And then all the critics can do is say, well, you're not doing it good enough. Like your candle's too dim. Not enough people are seeing your candle. It's getting wax all over the place. Well, what's the critics' alternative? They're just kind of sitting there in the comment section, not going out to create anything. But my main challenge there is logical, not saying, well, shut up and go make something yourself if you're all so good at it. My question is, hey, what would change your mind? Like, is your criticism even falsifiable? If someone comes along and says, Christian fiction bad, okay, well, what's the absolute minimum ratio that you would accept in order to flip the switch to Christian fiction good? Is it 20 good books for every one bad book? 30 good books? Like, how many people need to be cleared out of the city of Sodom before it's able to be destroyed? Like, it's really kind of ridiculous to paint with such a broad brush, especially if you're giving away the game by not applying the same criticism to secular culture. I would say that for every amazing, like, breakout movie that turns out to be a classic and the people love it and it wins the Oscars, there's probably hundreds of bad movies, even if you limit the ones released in theaters and don't talk about the streaming stuff. If there are but 10 righteous in the city, shall we spare it from criticism? Well, I think critics need to be more consistent. Yes, it may make sense and may even sound very spiritual to say, well, Christian fiction should be better. I have some challenges about that, especially because it takes a lot of work and is really hard on the family to make great stories. But I think what we're really dealing with here, Zach, is this temptation to punch the church and coddle culture. There's a line that there people apply this something like this to politics, but I think once again we see the mean old church back home syndrome come up. Well, darn it, they made me watch these lame movies. They said, no, dear, we have Superman at home, and then Superman at home was Bible Man. So instead of Christopher Reeve, you got the Willie Ames, and so people resent that. And I think, you know what, maybe you need to grow up and not act like the kid at the mall who's embarrassed by anything your mom does. Like, there's lots of embarrassing stuff in the world too by non-Christians. Just be consistent and challenge your expectations. I say if I find one great Christian-made fiction among 20 bad ones, then that novel was great. And I really just don't care about the bad ones or about generalities about the Christian culture.
Yeah, and I think we don't need to find the Christian version of everything. You know, we don't need Christian pro wrestling, Christian monster trucks, Christian acrobatics. I'm not referencing anything that's in the news right now. But yeah, we also don't need to limit ourselves to looking for the Christian version of things. There's so many great Christian stories that are just totally original, and I'm like, how did they think of this? But you know, we are the children of a creator. We are sub creators with him, and so we should expect Christian stories to be super original and creative. And yeah, Stephen, we really should resist that urge to be the good cop Christian that's going to win the approval of everyone because we're trashing all the other Christians out there. But I want to say something else about this, which is, you know, I personally do not want to be known as the guy who people turn to in order to validate their own criticisms of a story, whether it's a Christian story or a secular story. I just don't want to feed negativity. There's plenty of other people doing that. There's plenty of YouTube channels you can find doing that. And this occurred to me, Stephen, when I'll just be real vulnerable here. When the Wheel of Time show came out on Amazon, I'd been looking forward to this for years and years and years. And not just since Amazon had announced it. There were a lot of false starts for getting that series adapted to the screen. And I thought, man, this will be amazing. And I grew increasingly disappointed and jaded with it. And I just decided to blog all my thoughts, just kind of good, bad, ugly theories, you know, in whatever analysis I felt like making. But by the end, it was harder to do. And then season 2 come around and I couldn't even make it through, I don't know, a few episodes. And I thought about doing that again, just kind of writing out all my thoughts, sharing them with friends. But there was a certain point when someone asked me, like, oh, man, did you see that episode? How bad that was? What'd you think about that? And it really took me aback because I thought, is this how people know me? That like I'm the critic of this show and that's what they're turning to me for. And I really don't want to do that anymore. And I just don't want to be that way in general. I don't want to just be the echo of someone else's, you know, disgust with a film or a book or a story. I want to primarily be known for what I'm celebrating and promoting and also creating.
Zach, you just reminded me of a TV commercial I saw a long time ago. It was a promotion for the TV Land network featuring the late Adam West, who famously portrayed Batman in the 1960s. And I believe he had an example about a hamster running on a wheel, doomed forever to watch terrible newer TV shows, in which case Adam West could say, well, instead you can go back and watch the classics from back when TV was good. And I mean, they're playing it firmly tongue-in-cheek, and not just because it's Adam West, but then he just turns to the camera and he says in his classic deadpan, TV Land for TV satisfaction, because life's too short to watch crap. Which is a shorter version of what you just said. There's an overcorrection too when you decide to be a critic and declare that everything is terrible. And that leads me to point number 5, which I'll get to after sponsor 3, because one of the best things that Christian creators are doing is they're getting together in groups like the Story Embers organization, and they're training one another to get better. If you're a Christian writer looking for training that enriches you both as a writer and as a Christian, then the 2024 Story Embers Summit will help you discover how your faith intersects with your writing life when you're struggling over a scene in your manuscript. Your faith doesn't need to be on the sidelines of your writing journey. Authors like Sarah Ella, Stephen James, Carla Hawk, and Thomas Umstadt Jr. are coming together to tackle the tough issues Christian writers wrestle with. This summit will help you grow your confidence through thought-provoking sessions, small group discussions over Zoom, and even a query letter workshop. You can learn more about the 2024 Story Embers Summit and how the speakers can help you blend your faith and writing craft more effectively by visiting storyembers.org/summit. That is storyembers.org/summit. Registration is open now for this event from May 23rd through 25th of this year. Get the links in our show notes for episode 209 or at lorehaven.com/podcast. All right, speaking of authors, this is a shout out to all of the good and wise Christian creators out there who don't do this. Point number 5, authors, for God's sake, quite literally, don't promote your stuff as the solution. I actually don't see this tendency as much as I used to, because I've been doing this whole writers conference thing. You do? Okay. Well, I need to rely on you for some examples then, because I used to hear people at writers conferences and see comments and articles and stuff, and then people would make this little side hustle out of saying how bad the stories are among Christians, but oh, I'm the chosen one. I've got the book that isn't going to have the corny conversions, and it's going to have cuss words and all kinds of novelties among Christian fiction. So Zach, what have you heard? Speak.
Oh man, this one's really this pains me, and I don't know the solution, so I'm just going to say that at the outset. But I'm in a number of readers groups in different social media platforms, okay? And so I want to keep it vague because I don't want to call out any particular one. But there's a trend I've noticed where someone will just ask a very specific question. I think the last one I saw was something like, I'm looking for a medieval fantasy with no magic. Okay. So no wizards, no witches.
So Chuck Black, okay,
something like that. Yeah, and that was one of the suggestions, which I thought, hey, great, because we like his stuff here at Lorehaven, and one day we will probably chat with him. But anyway, there was a question like that. There were dozens, I mean, probably close to 100 comments on this particular post, and that I'm using as an example. And probably 80%, I'm exaggerating, more than half of the responses to this question were, well, if you'd like to check out my book, it's such and such, and here's the description, and here's the link to Amazon where you can buy it right now. There's something about that, Stephen, that immediately turns me off as a reader, because I think, is that all you have to say to this person is just your book? Like, are you just looking through all these comments to find the person looking for your type of book? And look, I get it. Indie publishing is hard. You're relying on word of mouth. You don't live in a bookstore. Like, your book doesn't live in a bookstore for people to find. It's not being promoted anywhere else. But I really think this is a matter of, we talk about wisdom, Proverbs 27:2, let another praise you and not your own lips. I mean, this is such an important principle, I think, for Christians most of all. Now, okay, there are ways to sort of get around this, right? Like, you can ask your friends, you can ask your author friends and you kind of cross promote each other. But even that is better than this very self-referential thing I often see. And again, I'm not talking about just one or two authors or one or two groups. Man, I see this so much, and it's and just, I'm going to be honest, it just puts those authors sort of like on the no-no list for books that I want to check out, because I see that as unwise behavior.
Yeah, it is a bit unwise. I would say, as a mild defense, that at least they didn't say, well, all those other books out there are bad, but here's my book. And that's kind of what I'm thinking of.
That's when it gets really bad. Sure.
That's when it gets really bad. Yeah. I mean, it's almost deceptive if you're saying, well, okay, you're looking for a book that's just like this. Well, here's my book. Like, all right, you should, if you were pitching your book anywhere, then you do this thing called comp titles, where you say, well, my book is kind of like that, but it's also a little bit like this. And you call that comp titles, comparison titles. Be aware of your market, authors. We're not the author podcast, but that's what you're supposed to do. In this case, I think some of the authors I've seen, at least in the past, they will lambast other Christian fiction. They will do the Christian fiction bad thing, and then they will offer themselves as the solution in response. Okay, so you got some cringe marketing there. Maybe their story isn't bad, but they've now stepped on all the other authors or all the other books, supposedly, and not even by name. And then often, at least in the past, I've seen that some of the other stuff overcorrects with supposed novelties like, well, my Christian fiction book is realistic. My Christian fiction, I don't ignore mental health, or I don't ignore hypocrisy into church. I'm going to be honest and grimdark. And I'm going to include those swear words and violence that you won't get in Christian books. That's a little bit of a chosen one complex. And Zach, you and I had an episode about that, about the whole chosen one author thing, and this notion that we need to wait for the prince, the author prince, right? Who's going to take over Christian publishing and just be the
Christian fiction prince.
It's going to be the ultimate Christian fiction author, is going to lead us to paradise, like Caesar from the Planet of the Apes. I think it's not only tacky, it actually can turn into kind of arrogance. And that's why, God willing, you will never hear that on this platform. No chosen ones. Jesus Christ is the chosen one, and we are but pale imitators of him for his glory. Far better, if you're going to observe problems in Christian fiction, do not promote yourself as the salvation. Just ignore the bad, train hard, sign up for something like the Story Embers Summit, sign up for Realmmakers, whatever. Get good for Christ's glory, not your own glory.
I want to say one other thing here about this whole phenomenon I'm talking about. Again, I get it. If you're an indie author, you've got to hustle, right? You've got to make those sales. I don't have a book for sale. So I guess I have that bias, right? I'm just a reader at this point. I'm not a published author or upcoming published author, as far as I'm aware, but I don't personally know the experience, okay? But I just want to ask a question. Do those Facebook comments ever result in sales? And if so, how many? And is that really the best way that you can get word of mouth? Because what I often see is when people recommend someone else multiple times, or when multiple people recommend the same author, that's what I actually pay attention to. And so I think a much better way for indie authors to approach this question of how do I put my book in a Facebook comment section is to align yourself with other like-minded authors who write in similar or even different genres, but you're friends with each other. You can, in good conscience, promote that other author. And then you guys go out there and promote that one author in those comments, because that's what actually gets my attention. It's when multiple independent people or seemingly independent people are talking about the same book. I'm like, okay, there must be something really good to this. I mean, that's how I've read other books that I wasn't sure if I wanted to read. There was a book that came out. It's a general market book that came out, but several of my coworkers who are not sci-fi readers all recommended it. I'm like, okay, this must actually be a good book, because they don't ever read sci-fi as far as I'm aware. So I want to recommend that to you indie authors out there. Join forces with others and then promote one another and not simply yourself.
100% agreed. I need to hasten along here to point number 6. This one, I think, is some of the overarching rationale for folks who are a little over-eager to promote their stuff, as opposed to that terrible, corny, cliched Christian fiction out there that your mama used to make you read. Point number 6 is, let's reject corny tropes like the world is watching. Now, I see this all the time, much, much more so than this idea of Christians who are trying to lambast other authors. It's a frankly self-righteous, I think accidentally self-righteous meme that spreads among Christians, and it goes a little something like this. The world is watching. They see us making cheap stories and conducting hypocrisy and too much politics. Therefore, we as the church must stop being so bad. Let's make better art. Let's stop being hypocrites. Let's get out of politics. Only then will people see that we are good people, not bad people, and start being more curious about what Christianity is. The world is watching. Let us perform for their praise. Well, who's missing from that? And yeah, I know I'm a little snarky there. I can't help myself, because that is the thing that I am going to criticize, because I think that does cross over into sin. Because who's missing from that call to ministry and mission in the world? Well, Jesus Christ is missing. There's no gospel there. There's no repentance, law, grace, forgiveness. It's not about the gospel. It's not about joy and delight. It's about doing your duty to impress the world. And it's a call to make better art in order to impress who exactly? The world? I hate it when people say the world. What a bad category there. It's a way too generalized. Are you talking about the guys on TV who are making fun of Christianity? Or are you talking about your neighbor down the road? Well, my neighbor down the road isn't your neighbor down the road. So let's stop calling them the world. And if you use that phrase, then I'm just going to hit you back with Jesus in John 15:18, saying, the world is going to hate you. Remember that it hated me first. So even if I'm one of those cheap, hypocritical, or overly political Christians, I'm just going to hit you back with, yeah, well, they hate me because they hate Jesus. Like, I could just totally weasel out of it, even if I'm a bad guy. So it's not enough. It's not even effective to say the world is watching you. I don't even know what that means. The world might be a corrupt politician who's trying to impose a sexual revolution on me. Ew. I don't care what he thinks. He's wrong. He is sinful, and the truth is not in him. He has bad judgment. Or it might be someone who was wounded by their church back home, and maybe I do need to be mindful about what that person thinks. But then I'm thinking about people. I'm thinking about individuals, and maybe some smaller groups to which individuals belong. But I'm not thinking primarily, ew, the Christians are embarrassing me. I'm back when I was a teenager and my mom is wearing something so unfashionable. That stuff is cringe criticism, and it's secondhand embarrassment. It's kind of immature, and it gets turned into legalism. And legalism is no foundation for better Christian storytelling. If you're going to critique the church and call for better stories from God's people, you need better reasons than the world is watching. That's why we here at Lorehaven, we contend for better stories, not because Jesus needs better PR, but because God is our creator. We get that not from surveys, but from scripture. God sets our creative standards, not worldly artists, and Jesus is our savior. He sets our example for heroism, not hate watchers of the church. And the Holy Spirit is our sanctifier. He's the one who's going to make us better for the glory of God alone. The silly critics are not really going to have that effect. So for my part, I think I'm going to end with that. If we're going to criticize tropes in Christian fiction, then get rid of the slimy tropes in the criticism too. I don't want any silly tropes that are unhelpful and unconducive to great storytelling and the drama of life reflected in fiction. I want to get back to reality, and sometimes the best fantastical stories are the best way to portray that reality. And the silliest criticisms are the worst made fantasy of all.
You know what the world is watching us for? It's whether we are unified in Christ, because that's what Jesus prayed for all of us in John 17. Starting in verse 20, he said, I pray not only for these, his disciples that were there with him in the Garden of Gethsemane, but also for those who believe in me through their word. That's us today. May they all be one as you, Father, are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe you sent me. So there is a lot riding on the unity of the church. And I don't just mean something simplistic like we shouldn't have different denominations or church buildings or whatever. It's really what Jesus commands us in John 13:34, where he says, just as I have loved you, you are also to love one another. And this criticism category, the corny, hey, the world is watching us, so don't make all this bad stuff, and this sort of this circular firing squad that can happen at times. This actually starts to tell people that Jesus is not for real, that he's not really God, that he and the Father are not one because his people are not one. And so this type of criticism is very counterproductive to the church. The church looks, or the world looks at the church to see if we actually believe when we say Jesus, God loves us and that Jesus loves us. If they don't see love happening between the fellow Christian, I think it's so much more important than we often say. My pastor has often said, you need to love the church that you have, not pine for the type of church that you wish you could have. I'm sort of paraphrasing him, the really harsh criticism, it pains me. And this takes me back to how Jesus will not break a bruised reed. There is a way to constructively criticize a Christian art. And believe me, I have plenty of opinions, and I try to share those in loving and usually private ways towards Christian creators. But man, so much is hanging on this. It's like, it's not just will the world accept us, it's will the world accept Christ through our witness of loving one another.
All this brings to mind in closing a possibly corny Christian song, which I'm going to adapt for this topic. They will know we're good critics by our love, by our love. They will know we're good critics by our love.
So to you, our listener, we would love to hear, what are your least favorite and most favorite Christian-made novels? This could get a little spicy, but send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com, or feel free to comment on this episode on our website, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, or our Discord server, the Lorehaven Guild. So now I want to turn to our comm station, where we have gotten some good feedback on episode 207 from Bob H., who says he has thankfully not encountered many Christians who scorn fiction. And Bob says, quote, "My family were big readers. I got my love of sci-fi from my dad. And I don't think I've ever encountered anyone in person who had anything to say against reading fiction." Wow. That seems a little bizarre to me. Seems mostly likely to be internet virtue signaling to impress a social media audience. For in-person discussions, I have more often encountered people who had a specific suspicion about a specific property, Harry Potter promotes witchcraft, that kind of thing. And that's usually a good faith argument that's worth an open-minded, thoughtful discussion, end quote. Well, Bob, I envy you. I mean, from the most part, in most of my life, it's been pretty similar. It just can be disorienting to people when that sort of criticism comes from inside the house, so to speak. But I think that's very true, that I think oftentimes these are people trying to impress other people. There's a very well-known red pill influencer who has come out against fiction and Star Wars, and even eating a good meal with others and enjoying the simple pleasures of life.
That's inhuman. That is just inhuman. It's like saying, I hate water. I can live without water.
Another note here from JPC Writer on episode 208, which was our last episode about the Logos Theater adapting Prince Caspian to the stage. This says, quote, "I spent an embarrassing amount of time daydreaming how I might get myself and my family to DC before the last show this month of Prince Caspian. Sadly, with all the parental health issues going on right now and my husband's overtime, it's probably not going to happen. But I'm so glad this type of thing is in the world. I had no idea that this theater group existed, and do hope to see one of their productions either in person or a recorded version someday. Thanks so much for covering this in the podcast. I'm looking forward to listening to the rest of this episode soon," end quote. And yes, JPC, that is exactly what mission accomplished. That's what we try to do. We knew that this is one of the best kept secrets of the East Coast, and we wanted more people to know about it because we want to see this kind of thing succeed. I think it's so cool. You're really going to like the rest of that episode, where Noah Stratton, the director of the Logos Theater, says, and this is a bit of a spoiler, they are adapting all 7 books, and they are going to have a round-the-year way for people to see them. So listen to that episode to find out what that is. That was episode 208.
Next on Fantastical Truth, as many people know, Lorehaven is a partner with Realm Makers, which is the leading fantastical conference for Christian creatives. Recently, Realm Makers shared that over 40% of registration for this July's conference are for first-time guests. That's kind of common for Realm Makers, though. They often have a lot of new people who've never been to a writers' conference show up at their annual summer events. And for me, this brings back memories of my first writers' conference, which wasn't Realm Makers. It was another conference. And Zach, I'm sure it does for you too. So we thought we'd share them with you next week. Even though we're not a writers podcast, we're going a little bit behind the scenes here. What is it like at one of these events? And more importantly, I say, what should a first-time guest expect at a writers' conference like Realm Makers? Well, find the good stories, y'all. And if you have a bad story that you're not too fond of now, find the good in that too. We are called to engage the culture after all, and that doesn't include just the high points of culture, but some of the subpar stuff as well. So long as it didn't tempt you to sin, I think that there's good stuff in every story to be found, whether it's a secular made story or a Christian made story. Do not be on a partial judge there. Discern wisely, discern with godly discernment, and promote the good stuff. And more likely, instead of criticizing the bad stuff, just pass it by. Pray for the people who made it. Pray that they will get better. And you get better with your criticism when you criticize, as we continue to seek and find Christ's fantastical truth.